In this video, we're going to learn how to create a dialog box add-in that allows us to modify a design on the screen. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on our API series, and this time we're going to get into creating an add-in, and we're going to look at creating an add-in dialog that can interact with the model. So there are a lot of steps with this process, and it's something that we need to take time to make sure that we understand. Now, with disclaimer with all the videos, I am not a programmer. So if you are and you see something that is just inherently wrong or there's a better way to do it, please leave a comment. Make sure that everybody understands that there are better ways to do this. But there's an important topic that I want to cover, and I've been meaning to cover for quite a while, and that's really the power of figuring something out. You can watch as many videos as you want, you can follow along with the process, but until you figure something out for yourself, you're probably not going to be able to commit it to memory in the same way as you do just following something when you're watching a video. Now, there is obviously something to be said for repetition. If you do something over and over again, you will be able to commit it to memory. But I think there's something very powerful about figuring a process out. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go through the process that I used to figure out how to do this. So we're going to take a look at some sample code that is built into Fusion 360. We're going to understand some of the resources, some of the basic layout of these programs, and then we're going to get into creating our own. We're going to go through a handful of steps. So again, first we're going to review existing code and identify some of the critical aspects of it. But then we're going to go through and add sliders to a dialog. We're going to get user parameters from a design. We're going to have it update the design when we click OK. We're going to have it update the design instantaneously when we start scrolling. And then we also want to make it start at the current user parameter value. So in this example right now, let's go ahead and drag these to the right. And you can see that we have length and width at about 830 or so. And the previous values were 553 and 415. If we go into our user parameters, and we take a look, we can see 829, 842. So if I run the code again, you can see the starting value is 829 and 842, and that's where the sliders are right now. So we want to take a look at this process and understand all those different steps in the way that we can get this information together. So I'm going to get started by reviewing some code in Fusion 360. I'm going to put chapters in this video, so if you want to skip ahead, feel free. The only prerequisite here is that you make a design that has user parameters, length, and width. If you don't use these values, you just simply need to be able to code whatever values you're using in your own program. But I'm using length and width, and the name is important. We need to make sure that it's case sensitive, in this case, capital L, capital W. Other than that, there's really no prerequisite to this. I do think it's important that you have at least taken a look at some of the other API videos so you have a basic understanding, but it's not strictly required. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my scripts and add-ins menu, and I'm just going to go ahead and stop the one that we were just looking at. And then we want to take a look at two different samples. Now, we've taken a look at creating scripts before, and you know that when you create a script, there is just a basic bit of text, of Python code that automatically comes up that creates basically a message, a box that pops up on the screen. With an add-in, recently it was brought to my attention through one of the subscribers that there is some new bit of code when you create a new add-in that creates a dialog box for you, and it does a few other things. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a new add-in. So we want to make sure that the type is add-in. I'm going to use Python, and I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to just call this API slider dialog. You can call it whatever you want. Notice there is a checkbox to run at startup. So at any point in time, an add-in can be turned on so that it automatically starts running at startup. Now, there are some inherent issues there, especially if we're hard coding things like the user parameters. But in this case, we don't want it to run at startup. Just note that add-ins are meant to be turned on and run with the program, and scripts are meant to just be run once. Also, we're going to go ahead and create this. And now we should have a new add-in called an API slider dialog. Now, if I run this, a couple things happen. When we go to the add-ins menu, we can see that we have send to palette, show my palette, and command dialog sample. These three things got added. one of them got pushed up to the toolbar, and all of them are located in the add-ins section of our utilities tab. So when we run the command dialog sample, we get a text box. It says enter some text, and we get in this case, a numerical input box that has 1 millimeter in it. If we say OK, a message box pops up on the screen and it tells us what those values are. We can say OK. The show my palette and send to palette are additional dialogues. So send to palette uses the same dialog box, except for it is going to be able to show on the palette. So the palette is essentially like an HTML dialog box that pops up. You'll note that sometimes these dialog boxes will contain help file information that'll navigate to a certain area. So you can have things like hyperlinks, you can have an HTML event handler. You can see that again, it pops up a dialog box here. So you can do all sorts of things, but that's outside of what we're going to do with our program. We're going to get rid of the send to palette, we're going to get rid of show my palette, and we're going to focus on the command dialog sample. But let's also take a look at the add-ins, and at the very bottom, the sample called command sample. Now when we run this, a couple different things happen. This time, it creates its own section on our toolbar. We're still in the utilities, but it's placed it in its own section, not in the add-ins. The reason that's important is because it gives us a difference in code, and we can determine how that was done. The next thing is that it adds a bunch of different samples. So we have hello world, basic, selections, everything, table, and browser. When we click on these, for example, selections, it's a dialog box that has some text here. It tells us to pick something, gives us the name and the type. Now all this information can be modified so that you can determine what sorts of properties you want out of that. So generally the code will go something like this. You'll have the name of the item dot name dot type dot material dot volume, those kinds of things, and that's information that you can pull out of that data. When we take a look at the command sample everything, so this everything is going to have a dialog box that contains all sorts of different parameters, different dialogues, different ways that you can interact. So we have a Boolean value that's true, false, turns on and off. You can see the string value down here is changing when we modify that. We have direction 1, which is modifying the arrow on the screen. We have direction 2, it's a light bulb turning that on and off. We have button row, you can see that we can move through here. We also have a drop-down list, a group with radio buttons. We have the selection, we can select a face on the screen. You can see that this is a text box message, and you can use basic formatting. So if you have a dialogue and you want some additional information, pretty much everything is here, and it will allow you to use that information to basically customize your own program. You notice that there's some on-screen manipulator here. After we selected the face, now there's a distance value, and it lets you move this up and down so you can see how to interact with the model. Now the bit of this that we really want is when we expand this, the additional value inputs, we now have a couple sliders. This first one is a float slider. You can see it's listed here. We have a float list. This is a slider with 2 different arrowheads on it. We have a float spinner. We have an integer slider, and we have an integer list and integer spinner. Now, all of these are important because these are the kinds of things that we're looking to do, and all of them are built into this everything sample. The second important bit of this is that this is all contained under this expandable menu called additional value inputs. Now, you've worked with Fusion 360 before. There's no doubt that you've seen these additional value input type dropdowns or expansions in dialog boxes. Especially if you work in the manufacturing workspace, a lot of times toolpaths will have these where you can check and activate them or expand them for additional options. So now that we know that the slider information is contained within that sample, and that we have a starting point command dialog sample, this is a great place for us to jump into the code and understand what's happening in each. You'll notice that it opened up a dialog box here, and it kind of tells us everything that we did in that, and that's partially based on the commands, the way that the commands were written. If this pops up for you, just go down to your File, View, and then hide your text commands. Okay, so now that we have that hidden, the next step is to go into the code. Because the code is going to be very tricky, especially for us non-programmers, we're going to start with the command dialog sample, and then we're going to jump into the command sample that has everything in it. So from the scripts and add-ins menu, from your add-ins, the new one that we created, API slider dialog, we're going to select edit. Now for me, in Windows, this opens up in Visual Studio Code, and it happens to be on a separate window, so let me bring it over. Yes, I'm going to trust the author, and now we have the code that is going to be used to create everything that we saw. There are a couple of areas of Python code in general with object-oriented programming that you need to understand. The structure of the code and the folders specifically is an important aspect of how each of these bits of the code get broken down. So when we get started, whatever our program is called, in this case API slider dialog.py, this is going to be the name of the program that we run. When we go into the add-ins and scripts, when we find our add-in, that's going to be the name of our Python file that runs. Inside of that code, it's going to import commands. Now commands is this menu up here, which we're going to get to in a minute. Then it's also importing from .lib information about utilities, and it's bringing those Fusion 360 utilities as futil. So FU Fusion utilities. So inside of there, under the Fusion 360.lib, we have the init.py, event utilities, general utilities. Now for this example, we're not going to be going into there. I just wanted to point out where they were because it's an important aspect of how the code works. Inside of the rest of this bits of code, you see that we've got the def run and we've got the def stop. Now the stop and the run, these functions that are defined inside of this bit of code, determine how the program gets started and what happens when it's stopped. So the important part again for us is looking at import commands and commands.start. When we expand commands, we have information about the command dialog, the palette send, and the palette show. These were the three things that got placed on our menu. Also note that there is a config.py that has some additional information. Again, we're not going to be too worried about this stuff for right now, but I do want to just note what these things are inside of this dialog to make sure that we can just see what information comes in with pretty much every one of these sample programs. So now that we know that it's pointing to commands.start, inside of this commands dropdown, which is essentially a folder inside of your computer, we have this init.py. Now this init is, think of it as the initialization. This init.py is going to be where it's looking first. And from inside of here, we have from command dialog import entry as command dialog. Then from palette send and palette show, it's doing the same thing, entry as palette show. And then down here in the command section, these are the three things that get created inside of our user interface. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to mess this up. And by mess this up, what I mean is we're going to get rid of palette show and palette send and this extra comma here, and we are going to save this. Now back in Fusion 360, I'm going to go back into my add-ins. I'm going to go to command samples. I'm going to stop it. I'm going to go to my API slider dialog and stop it, and then I want to run it again. Now what we should see is when we run this, we only get our command dialog sample. We don't get the send to palette and show palette. And that's because inside of our code, we got rid of those things from the commands. Now they're still listed up here as from palette show import entry, from palette send import entry, but you will notice that the code on the far right is now sort of grayed out a little bit. Now, this means in Python that it's not being referenced or used anywhere. So I'm going to put a £sign in front of both of these, which is essentially turning them into comments. Turning them into comments for now is important because I'm going to leave this code in here. And that way, as you continue to play around with this, if you ever want to add additional buttons or additional functionality, you can always reference that information. But you will need to remember that you will have to put the command dialog, palette show, palette send, whatever these things are called, you will need to put that in here. And then at the bottom of this init.py, you'll see that we have def start, which is starting the function, which is essentially putting all these into our user interface. Well, it's going into the code, which is doing that. And then we have a stop, the stop function for the end of the module. So basically we're starting everything and we're stopping everything. So I'm going to do a quick save on that, and then I'm going to move into my command dialog. So by expanding this, you'll also note that it has this init.py. This is sort of the initialization. It's looking for code here, but in this case, it's empty because nothing is really happening here, because what we were doing was we were importing entry. So we're going to find entry.py, and this is where everything is going to happen. So if you're still following along and you still want to kind of see what's going on, this is going to be the bit of code that determines what's in our dialog box. A couple things happen at the top, a couple things happen in the middle, and a couple things happen at the end. At the top, what we're doing is we're grabbing all the references we need. If you think back to some of the initial programs that we wrote, the scripts, we were importing and we're bringing in things like Autodesk Core, Autodesk CAM, Autodesk Design. And it's important because that brings in those commands and the functionality that goes along with interacting with Fusion. There's also additional things that come in, such as from the .lib, we're bringing in the Fusion 360 utilities as FUTIL. You'll see that come up several places in the code. So for example, FUTIL, add handler. Now, the handlers are going to be ways in which it deals with inputs, and we'll get to that in a second. So it's important that we do take a look at the top of this code so we understand what we're bringing in, because in just a little bit, we're going to have to add some more to it. Now, as we go down, you can see there are a couple of other things that are going to be important. Command dialog sample is the name of the tool that gets added to the Fusion 360 user interface. So I'm going to call this one slider dialog. And as soon as we save it and we rerun that script, or that, in this case, the add-in, it's going to change the name of that dialog. And we're not going to do that just yet. The next thing is this is promoted. Now in Fusion 360, whenever you're working with tools, whenever you have a list of items, the three dots on the right-hand side will allow you to pin to toolbar. Now, pinning something to the toolbar is a way of promoting it. Now, they call it is promoted inside of the code. And this just essentially means, is it in the drop-down list or is it at the very top level as well? So is promoted is true, which means that it's putting it at the top of our toolbar for us. As we go down, the panel ID, this information here is a little bit antiquated because Fusion 360, if you've been using it since about 2017 or 2018, it used to just be a design workspace for solids. There would be a patch workspace for surfaces. There'd be a form workspace for forms. But the user interface changed several years ago to now we have tabs for solids and surfaces and mesh and sheet metal and all those different things. But I think some of the code in the back end is still referring to some of those old bits of code because the API was generated and created way back then. So the workspace ID, Fusion Solid Environment, used to just be for solids, but now it's sort of everything because we have these toolbars, or in the back end, they're called panels. So then we have Solid Scripts Add-ins panel. Now, if you want to find another place to put this panel ID, you're going to have to dig through the Fusion 360 resources, the help file. I'm going to just leave it where it is for now, but I do want to just point out this is what's controlling where your tool is going to end up in the UI. Next, as we go down, there is this icon folder, and it's pointing to something called resources. Most of these command dialog boxes or the palette send, they have resources folders, which will contain different icons. Now, if you are going to be working with custom images or custom icons, it's important that you try to maintain a structure like this. So you want to make sure that you do maintain this resources folder and you place that information in the resources folder. Now we're getting down to some of the code that things start to happen. All of that stuff before was pretty much a reference to get started on what different libraries or bits of code were needed to make things happen, where the toolbar was going to be placed, and now we're getting into what's called handlers. Now the handlers are going to be important because they do a few things. They handle input from the user. Now, handle is a general term, but essentially we're going to have a handler for if a slider is changed, we're going to have a handler for if the user pressed OK, if the user pressed cancel, and it needs to know what to do with that information. So the local handlers and this sort of brackets here, this is just a container. It's just a place for it to hold that information. So it's an open variable, which is essentially an array or a list of items, and it can add those items to it later on in the code. As we get down farther, def start and def stop, these are going to be the way in which the code generates the toolbar, or generates the icon on the toolbar, I should say, and the way that it sort of cancels it and deletes it. So when you run this code, it's going to the top level of the .py. It's going to reference the information inside of the init.py for the commands, and then it's going to start to build out the rest of the parts of the program. In this case, the only thing we're doing is the command dialog. So what it's doing is it's building out each of those based on the ID, the name, the description, where the icon folders are, and it's creating that command for us. And stop is kind of the opposite of that. So when the add-in is stopped, when we go into the add-ins and scripts menu and we tell it to stop, it's going to find all those things it created, and it's going to delete the control and delete the definition. So the control is the button that we press on the toolbar, and the definition is all the other stuff in the back end about what to do. So that's really what the run and the stops is going to be doing. It's going to be handling creating those elements and getting rid of them. But now we get into the part of the code where we're going to start making changes and start interacting with the user. We want to add the sliders. We want to know what kind of information we can pass back and forth. The first thing to note here is there is a hyperlink that you can go to the command inputs. So if we hit Control and we take a look at this, I'm going to go ahead and just bring this over from another monitor. So here we can see that the objects are command inputs. As we go down, these are all the different command inputs that we can add. Drop-down command, distance value, direction, button row, browser command. So essentially, as you look through this list, you can find the different types of input that you want to use and get more information about them. So for example, we're going to be using the add integer slider. We're also going to be using the add float slider. So those are the two commands that we're going to be looking at. And when we look at each of these, there is Python and C++ sample code, gives you a return value, and it lets you know what parameters it has. So in this case, it has an ID, a name, a value list, which could be a min and max value as defined in the command. So if we take a look maybe at some samples, you can see it's pointing you to the command input samples, which is the one we've tested. But it has an integer list, which we can give a min and max value, or we can give it an actual list, an array of values that we want to include. And then there is the has two sliders Boolean. So just keep in mind that this does provide a lot of value. You can look at this, you can find the sample code. It's likely going to point you back to some of the samples that we're looking at now, though. So now that we're inside of the command created function, what we're looking for is the bits of the code where things happen. So command created, this whole section here, we've got this command created event, this log, which is going to store information that happens. And this is important because, once again, nothing is final until we hit OK. The way that this is set up, if we hit cancel, it's going to revert back to the initial settings. So that log is a way for it to sort of capture what's going on. And then we have our inputs equals our args.command inputs. So this parameter and the variable that's storing this data is going to be used for us to build out those inputs. Now, there is other code that we're going to look at when we look at the sample that has everything in it. You'll notice that there's going to be a difference here because that code is going to put our slider into a group, and it's going to have something different than inputs. But in this case, we have inputs.add text box, It's going to have some text, and then we've got an inputs add value input. And those bits of information are going to be referred back to with the string, value input, and text box. So it's going to store that information for us based on those identifiers. There is a bunch of the Fusion 360 utilities to handle different aspects of this command. So executing the command, if the input has changed, if we're previewing, if we're destroying, like in this case, canceling out of it and putting the model back how it was, these are all the handlers that have been generated automatically for you in this code. And then as we go down a bit further, we've got execute, which is this first handler. Go down a bit further, preview, input changed, validate input, and destroy. Now, we're going to be working in the input changed area because we want a model eventually to update when we move the slider back and forth. The program as it stands now, when we execute, when we hit OK on the dialog box, then it takes those values, in this case, the name text box and value input, which come from those literal strings that are defined as the ID for those inputs. The information that's contained in those gets pulled out, and then it gets generated or put into a message that the user is prompted. So that is the entire program. All the other stuff has to deal with the event handling or bringing in resources or pulling in all that data. And thankfully, all of that's already done for you. So you don't have to worry too much about going through and figuring all that out. But we will have to add some stuff to make this work. Now that we've seen this just a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick save. I'm going to go back to Fusion. I'm going to go back to my add-ins. I'm going to find that API slider. I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to rerun it again. And the reason I'm going to rerun it is because we changed the name of it. Now it's showing up as slider dialog instead of command sample. So that's just an important note that we did change something. I'm also going to go down to the command sample, and I'm going to select edit. So when this pops up, the structure of it is going to be very similar. Now there are going to be some differences, but we are going to identify the bits of code that are important to us. So the first thing to note is that the name of the script or the add-in is command sample.py. So that's the first thing that happens. And just like before, it's calling the from.import commands, which is this commands folder. And then it's also bringing in the Fusion 360 utilities. So start and stop, those are the two main bits of code. It's going into commands, and it's going to reference the init.py. So from here, it's going to start calling the commands that we see pop up in our toolbar. Hello world, basics, selections, everything table browser. So if we don't want those things to appear, we can start modifying the code inside of here. Now, keep in mind that this command sample was one that's preloaded with Fusion 360, not one that we really want to go in and start messing around with unless we make a copy of it. The other one happens every time you create a new add-in. That sample bit of code we can just mess with as much as we want because every time we create a new one, it'll just rebuild it. But I just want to point out a few things in here. So once again, it's calling up and importing entry from each of those. And the one that we really looked at was everything. So from everything, we're going to look at entry. A couple of different things get imported here, like import math. And part of the reason for that is because in the back end of Fusion 360, all of the linear units are centimeters. All of the angular units are radians. So it needs that .math to convert those values into degrees. So for example, it's using math.py. Because of that, they had to import math. It's not going to affect us. We're not going to be importing math, but just keep in mind that's why that happens. And once again, in the command created area, we have the command created event, the feudal.log. We've got a couple of handlers. We don't have as many as we do in our sample. And then we start seeing these inputs. These inputs get created for things like the angle input command. We also have some true false options for that. So minimum value, maximum value. We also can see things like button rows or directional inputs or distance inputs. So as you look through this code, if there was anything in that initial sample, that command sample for the everything that had all of those different options, you can come through this code and it's all very well written and organized so that you can find those items. Radio list item 1, 2, 3, true, false, false, and then you can have these options where you can pre-toggle one on or off, and you can determine what happens when you change one. Now, the thing that's important for us starts to come into play when we find the sliders, and this float slider and an integer slider. So we have an integer slider command here, and we have a float slider command. Now, as I mentioned before, these are different because they ended up in a subgroup called additional value inputs. So these additional value inputs happen for just the sliders that we saw because they are added to this subgroup. So they have a group input, and then they have children. The expanded false or true is going to determine whether or not it's automatically and then we have children.addFloatSlider command input. So if in your case, in your dialog, you want to have a subgroup, you can do that by adding these bits of code and then using children dot and whatever you're adding to it. In our case, we're going to use the inputs dot to add the values, and that's going to be the way in which we interact with it. Now, it's also important to note that some of these things are grayed out because they're not being referenced anywhere. Now, you don't have to have this int slider input equals and then have the add integer slider command input. You can just have this because it has a name identified with it, in this case, int slider input. But having this container gives us a bit more information that we can handle and deal with. So we'll take a look at that later on in our program. So that was just a basic look at the differences between those two samples. And the main things I wanted to point out were, one, this child group, because that can be a handy way to organize things, all of the various samples that are in here, and then just the basic overall structure of the program. So once again, to get started, we are going to begin with small steps, just adding the slider. But the first thing that you should do is make sure that you do have a design that is saved, that has parameters called length and width, or if you're using different parameters, make sure you just know the names for those. So let's go ahead and bring back our code on screen. This is our API slider dialog. And right now we're working inside of the command dialog inside of the entry.py. Now remember, we stopped displaying palette send and palette show. The code is still in here. We can go into the folder location and delete those if we want to get rid of them. But for right now, we're just going to leave them. So now that we're inside of this code, we need to think about what information we need. We are going to have to gather information about the user parameters, but that's not the first step for us. The first step is to make sure that we understand how to display a slider, and then we can worry about all the little bits and connecting the pieces together. So find the bit inside of the code. So we're going to scroll down until we find the command created section, and we have creates a simple text box input, and we have creates value input field. And below that, we start to have the handlers, and then it moves into the command execute. So I'm going to start creating some space in here, and I want to use the # to add a comment where we're going to create input sliders. So we're going to do a slider for a float, and we're going to do a slider for an integer. But when I was figuring all this stuff out, I had an issue with the integer slider connecting to the user parameter values. I did some digging. I did find some older references that there was a bug with some of this, but I'm not really sure if I'm just potentially doing something wrong, but we'll talk about that when we get to that point. But for right now, we're going to just at least explore both of those. Now, as we saw, inputs dot whatever is going to be the way in which we add these inputs. So we're going to start with inputs, and we're going to add a float slider command. So as we start to type capital F, you can see we have three options. Add float slider command input, I'm going to hit tab. And then we need to start with brackets. I'm going to do single quotes, and I need to give it a name. This ID is going to be what we're going to use to call values from it later. So I'm going to call this float underscore slider underscore length. because I want to call it something that is literal because I want to be able to understand it in the code. You could call it FSL or make it something that you don't have to type quite as much. But for me, just float slider length is going to be fine. Then we're going to do a comma. And the next bit we can see highlighted in the dialog is that we need to give it a name. So again, single quotes, the name is going to be what's displayed to the user in our dialog. So we're going to call this length slider. Again, comma, the next is going to be a unit type. Now, this is a little bit tricky with this specific one. So we're going to go ahead and just put millimeters in here. But the reason this is a little bit tricky is because in the back end, this is all centimeters, but it's going to display or millimeters on the screen. Next, we need to give it the low end and the high end. So we want this to go from 100 millimeters to 1,000 millimeters. We need to do 10 and then 100. And again, that's because this is centimeters in the back end. And the last bit of this is going to be false because we don't want it to have two sliders. We're just going to do one. We're going to repeat this entire process as inputs.add integer slider this time. This one, I'm going to go ahead and call something. Let's go ahead and call this one float slider width. The reason I'm calling this float slider is because I know that the integer is not going to work for us in the end. So I'm just going to call it float slider width because that way it's easier to deal with later. We're going to call it float slider. This one does not actually need units, but we need to enter a min and a max value. Now, something that I found interesting with this is you actually enter these in the document units. So we're going to do 100 millimeters to 1,000, and then we're going to say false. So we don't want two sliders here. We're going to do a quick save. We'll go back to Fusion 360, go back to our add-ins, and let's go ahead and run this. So now if we run this, we should see that we still have the original some text, some value, but now we have a slider, and this is our float slider that goes from 100 millimeters to 1,000, and then we have a width slider that goes from 100 to 1,000 as well. Notice that these are all whole numbers, while the float has 3 decimal places attached to it. So again, just a different way to display the information. We say, okay, we still have this message box that pops up. That's okay, not too worried about what's going on there. But that was the first bit, making sure that we understand how we can add those sliders to the code. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code and think about our next steps. So now that we are able to add the sliders to our dialog box, the next thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we can gather information from the current design, in this case, the user parameters. So all the way back up at the top of our entry.py, we want to make sure that we are bringing everything in that we need. So this code by default is bringing in autodesk.core, which is great, but if we want to interact with the design, we also need to bring in adsk.fusion. Now there's some other things that we can bring in as well, but for us, those are going to be the main two things. We also want to make sure that we bring in additional information from the design itself. So I'm going to add a comment here. So I'm going to put the pound sign, and then I'm going to just say that we need to bring in the design and user parameters. So this is something that we've done before in previous lessons. So we're going to do design. This is just kind of the standard nomenclature. Sometimes you'll see it in code as just DES. This is adsk.fusion. Again, that's the reason why we needed to import adsk.fusion.design. And we're going to cast this to the active product. So this is essentially what we're doing is we're taking the current file that's open, the current design that's open, and we're associating it with this variable design. And then we want user params. I'm just going to shorten that up so I don't have to type the whole thing. That's going to be equal to design, which was the variable we just created, dot user parameters. So that gives us access to all the different bits of information that we're going to need. Obviously, if you need other things like to interact with sketches or tools like extrude or modification features like fillet, you'll need a bit more to pull out of this design. But for us, just interacting with user parameters, these are the only two bits of information that we need. Next, we want to take a look at the information before anything gets created. So I'm going to come in here before def.start, and I want to get the user parameters. So I want to make sure that I bring in this information and I store it. So I'm going to create some variables. The first one I'm going to call length param, and this is going to be equal to our design dot user parameters dot item by name. And this is exactly what we did before when we were working with user parameters. And this is where it needs to be case sensitive. So I'm using length. So I need to make sure that first off the L is capital and then all the rest of the text matches. Next, I want to bring in the width parameter, and it's going to be equal to design dot user parameters dot item by name again. And this time again, capital W I D T H. So those 2 bits of code are going to gather the information that's currently stored in the design in Fusion 360. The design, again, is going to be the current active product document that's open, and then it's going to store that information in length param and width param. And this happens before the command is run. So at this point, it's already been built into the program, but now this bit of code happens at the very start. The next thing that we want to do is we want to know that we got that information. So I'm going to go down into the code where we have command created, and instead of having the inputs, the text box and the default units and all that stuff, instead of having those, what I want to do is I want to just define a text box where I can display this information. So in order to do that, I'm going to leave all this code in here, but I'm going to just put the # in front of it. I don't need to worry about the default length units or default value, but those could be handy for some reason later. So I'm going to leave them. I'm not going to comment them out. But I am going to add some more information in here. I'm going to go ahead and create inputs to display, and it's going to be display current values. Now, we won't really need this later on when we're able to connect the current user parameter values to the slider, but as sort of an intermediate step, it's a good idea for us to validate that we are gathering that information. So these are going to be inputs dot add text box command input, and then I'm going to call this first one text underscore box. And then it's going to be my previous length. So it's just a way for us to prompt the user, tell the user that it's the previous length. Now, we can't just type in length param, unfortunately. We have to gather the information that we want from that parameter, because if you think about it, a user parameter is a name, an expression, a unit, a value. There are all these different bits of it. So for us, the thing that we want is actually going to be the expression. So the length parameter dot expression, the next bit is the number of rows. In this case, we're just going to do 1. And then is read only. Now, if we want it to be read only, if we don't want to allow the user to change anything, we could say false. If we want it to be read only, we can say true. Now, in this case, the user can change it. It won't really do anything because we're not going to do anything with the number that we get back, but that's something that we should think about. Next, we're going to do the same thing again. Of course, you could just copy this. I'm going to call this text underscore box 2. Again, we're not using this information for anything. We're just displaying it to the user. It's going to be our previous width. And then we're going to do our width param dot expression, just like before, 1 row, and we're going to say true. And what this should do is this should change the way that our dialog looks. It should now put up a text box that contains the information from our current user parameter. Now, before I go too much further, I also want to come back down into this command execute and get rid of this UI message box. I don't really need to see this. Don't need to generate the message or the expression or the text. I'm going to leave this information here for now again, just because there's no reason that I need to get rid of it just yet. When we get closer to being finished, we'll go ahead and clear out some of this. But let's go ahead and save it. go back to Fusion, and let's run this add-in. So API slider dialog. Now when we run it, we should see that we have values that are read-only, so we can't click on that box and edit them. And it's telling us that the previous length, 638, 686, the previous width, 421, 898. And you can see that I can modify these, but they still don't do anything. They're not connected in any way. So we're making some progress. We now have a dialog box that gives us information about the user parameter, and that's good information. But there's a lot more that we can do. So let's go ahead, make sure that everything's saved, and the next step for us is to now either update the design with the user parameter value, or to have the design update automatically with the slider. So there's like 3 more steps to this process. The order in which you decide to work on this really depends on how you understand the code and what your level of comfort is making a bunch of changes at once. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start by updating the design when OK is clicked with the values from our sliders. So in order to do that, a couple of other things have to happen first. So when we think about this and where the current dialog box is, we have text boxes that contain information about the current user parameter values. And then we have sliders, which their IDs are float slider length and float slider width, that currently do nothing. We can move them around on screen, but nothing is really happening. So when we come down to the command execute, this is where things will happen when we hit OK. So what we want to do is we want to find a way that we can take the information that we had from our user parameter and take the information that we had from our slider, and we want to populate the user parameter with that slider information. So I'm going to come down below all this stuff because we're going to probably just gut it anyways. I'm going to put a comment here, get and set UP, user parameter. Now obviously you can write as much as you want for these comments. It's always a good idea to comment your code, at least to remind yourself, what you need to do to go back. But the bits of information that we need here is we need to gather the information from the sliders. And to do that, we're going to start by creating a new variable. So I'm going to call this length param new. I'm going to use a colon, and I'm going to set this equal to ADSK core dot float slider command input. All right, so this float slider command input is going to be equal to inputs, which again was the inputs that we defined as the command inputs, dot item by ID. Now, item by ID is important because it allows us to get information out of all sorts of different functions, but we need to know the exact name of the ID. So in this case, the ID is called float underscore slider underscore length. Now, notice that with commands like inputs dot item by ID, we're able to auto-populate those, but when we have things like a string, a literal string that we typed in, even though it's an ID, that's not going to auto-populate for us. Things like length param new will, those variables that we create, but these names are not going to. So now what we've done is we've stored the information saved from float slider length into length param new. It's just a different way that we can go about doing this. There are other ways that you can do this, and I know we've talked about this before in other videos, but for this case, let's go ahead and just do with param new colon adsk.core dot, let's go ahead and do float. Actually, did we do an integer? Yeah, we did an integer. Okay, so we're going to do integer slider input. So we have an integer slider command input, and that's going to be equal to inputs dot item by ID. And once again, we need to know the name of the thing that we have. In this case, it's going to be float underscore slider underscore width. So what this should do is it should take the information that is in the current sliders and put it into this right here. The next thing that we want to do is we want to update the parameters, the user parameters, with this new information. So the way that we do this is we go to our user params. This is the variable that we created, dot item by ID, or I'm sorry, item by name in this case. And then the name is going to be length. So length for our user parameter. And we're going to do dot expression equals length param new dot expression 1. Now this is a little tricky because the expression 1 and expression 2 deal with a slider that has 2 slider positions on it. Now when we defined our slider we said false because we only wanted 1. But if you happen to have them for like a min and a max value, expression 1 and expression 2 will be the low slider and the high slider. If you only have 1, then it's just expression 1. We're going to do the same thing for user params dot item by name for width. And again, these are case sensitive. You need to make sure that you're exactly matching. Expression equals width param new dot expression 1. So theoretically, if this works, what we should see is that when we click OK, the program is going to update the user parameters based on whatever the slider's at. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back into Fusion. I'm going to go back to my add-ins. I'm going to turn or start the API slider dialog, and then we're going to run it. So the current length and the current width, 638 and 421. These are both at 100. If I select OK, it now has resized that for us. If I run it again, now you can see they're starting at 100. If I change just the length slider to 704, you can see it now updates. When we come back in, it says 704. Now here's the true test, if the integer one is going to work or not. Now you will notice that these sliders are resetting themselves to 100 each time. And that's because we haven't told it what those starting values are. But the important bit is that they're working. When we move the slider and we hit OK, it's updating the design for us. And we know that that aspect of it works. So that tells us that we are able to interact with the user parameters based on the sliders. So the next bit of this, let's go ahead and make sure everything's saved. So the next bit of this is for us to update the design while we're sliding. So at this point, we put this bit of code here inside of command execute, which only happens when we hit OK. So we can get rid of some of this. We don't need the text box. We don't need all that extra stuff. All we really need to do inside of here is to get the values from the sliders and push them into the user parameter. But now what we want to do is we want that to happen when something else is going on. So we've got 2 areas that this could potentially work. We've got input changed and we've got preview. So let's try to put this in the preview first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little space under here. And theoretically, we should just be able to take this code. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to put it down here. Now, Python is very sensitive to formatting. So you need to make sure if you had any of those red squiggly lines like that, you need to make sure that everything is tabbed into the correct space so that it knows it's inside of this function. Let's save this and let's just give it a shot and see if it works. So I need to stop the add-in and then restart it to make sure that all the new code is running. All right, so currently it is using the value from the slider to update the design. So the integer is working, the length slider is working, which is the float slider, and the width slider, which is our integer slider. So everything's updating properly. When I click OK, it's storing that information. When I restart it, it goes back to 100 for each of those values because those are the default values. That's what is populating the slider location. So this means that everything so far is working pretty well. The next step of this process is for us to take it to the next level where we can bring in the user parameter value and store it in the slider value. So let's go back to our code. And let's think about where we could put this information. So it doesn't make sense to do it in the preview. It doesn't make sense to do it when it's being executed when we hit OK. But if we come back up here inside of the command created, this is where we define our sliders initially. And this is where we can put in values for their initial value. So the way that we're going to do this is we are going to change the function just a little bit. We have to make just a slight change here. So before, when we looked at some of the sample code, some of these add commands, in this case the add float slider and add integer slider, had a variable in front of them and an equals. Now those aren't strictly required unless you're trying to pass all the variables into something. Now we can use the ID and we can pull out some information, but in order for us to actually set that initial value, we need to actually populate a variable. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a variable called length slider and set that equal to this input. I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm going to call this one width slider and set that equal. Now they're gray for the time being because we haven't used them anywhere. But the way in which we use these is we're going to set length slider dot value 1. And again, this is kind of an interesting situation because the sliders can have multiple positions. It can have a 1 and a 2 position. But what we want to do is we want to set the length slider dot value 1 equal to our length param dot value. And this is where I really ran into trouble with the integer slider. The integer slider, for some reason, did not like this at all. It would not work for me. Let's try it again just to make sure. So our width slider dot value 1 is going to be equal to our width param dot value. Now what this should do, if we save this and we go back to Fusion 360, what that should do is it should start the slider at whatever the current user parameter value is. So we can see here the user parameter value for the previous length is 494. The float slider, it works fine. The previous width is 638, but it's not working. And you can see it no longer is updating the design here. So we did something to break the code and it's not updating here properly. Now part of that comes back to the fact that the integer slider just wasn't working properly for me. And I don't know why, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this width slider. Instead of an integer, I'm going to call this one a float slider, which means that we need to come back in here, we need to make some adjustments to these values, and I need to add back in the units. So the units are going to be just millimeters, again, that displays on the screen, and the values are in centimeters, so it's going from 100 to 1,000. Now with those float sliders, let's go ahead and save this, and let's just see if that change made anything happen. So we're going to come back in, stop and restart the add-in, and now you can see those values are working. So once again, it's pulling in those initial values, those previous values, and again, they're read-only, so you can't do anything with them, and it's allowing you to make adjustments to the design. Now, if we hit cancel, you can see that it's thinking, and then it goes back or reverts to its original shape. If I go ahead and hit OK, it should update those user parameters, and now this is the new size. So once again, if we make changes and we hit cancel, it remembers those initial values and it's automatically taking care of doing that for us because of the handlers that are built into the program right now. It's nothing that we coded, nothing that we did that allowed it to undo that. It was all based on the original code. So I would love for this to work with the integer slider, and it does work in the fact that we can update this. But for whatever reason, I wasn't able to get it to work pulling in the user parameter for the integer slider type. Now the integer slider value is listed as a float, but I think that there is just some issue between the user parameter value and the integer value that it's looking for. It allows me to use it to set the value, but it's not allowing me to bring it in and populate this. With some more work, it could probably be done, but again, it's kind of outside of what we were really trying to accomplish with this. So now that we have this working, it's time to think about next steps. Where would you go from here with a design like this? Well, right now everything is hard coded. You need to have a design that has length and width parameters. They really should be inside of the range of this design. Now, if we go into our change parameters and we set one of these at, let's say, 50, and we set this one at 1500, and we go ahead and we run this, you can see that it's not working because it takes 50 and then it changes it to be 100, but then the width slider is just gone because those parameters are sort of outside of the range and it doesn't know what to do with it. So there are some definite limitations to how this thing can behave, and we really didn't worry too much about error handling or worrying about any of those aspects. So you can see once those values are within range, everything works fine. If they're outside of that range, then things get a little tricky. Now, of course, you could just make the range really large or custom tailored to your design, but just keep that in mind that there are some limitations based on the way that the thing is set up right now. But a couple other things that you could do is you could pull in all the user parameters from a design and potentially allow the user to use checkboxes to click which ones they want to move around. There's other ways that you could possibly link those values together. So you could combine length and width sliders so that they move together in the back end with the code, assuming that you had some checkboxes and you linked them together. Kind of just depends on what you want to do with a program like this. Or at its current stage, there's really not much value in it, but it does show promise that you can design and build a dialogue that might let you explore some of your design possibilities a little quicker. From here, I don't think I'm going to cover that very much more. The next thing on my API list is to talk about selections, which we did see in some of the samples. When you go to scripts and add-ins and you go to the command sample, the selection dialog is in there. So some of the code is already there for us. We just have to figure out what to do with it. So that's probably the next thing on my list. If you have any questions about what you saw here, please let me know. Always remember that you can send me an email, support@caducator.com. Another disclaimer, I am not a programmer, so no, I cannot make programs for you. It's just well outside of my wheelhouse. We did also set up a Discord server if you want to be part of that. You can also send me an email, support@caducator.com, and I can send you the link to get online with that. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next